24 years of service does not make you indispensable, Gerald. It just makes you expensive. Maxwell Stone said those words without raising his voice, and that flat, cold tone made them feel even worse. He slid a thick, white termination packet across the mahogany conference table, leaning back in his leather chair as if he had just approved a routine software upgrade. Instead of ending the career I had spent nearly half my life building, I stared at the packet, then looked up to meet his eyes. My name is Gerald Brooks. I was 58 years old, the principal software architect at Summit Forge Systems, and until that rainy Friday afternoon, I had been the longest-serving technical leader in the entire company. 12 minutes later, I was not even an employee. If you have ever had a boss mistake your quiet loyalty for weakness, you will understand why I did not argue, raise my voice, or shed a single tear in that room. I was too busy realizing that they had absolutely no idea what they had just done. Maxwell folded his hands over his expensive silk tie. We are restructuring engineering leadership. Your position is being eliminated. Effective immediately. Effective immediately, I repeated, testing the words. Beside him, Teresa Croft from the Human Resources Department kept her eyes firmly fixed on the paperwork in front of her, refusing to look at me. Then Maxwell delivered the detail he clearly expected would hurt me the most. Bradley Finch will take over all engineering operations. He starts on Monday morning as our new Vice President of Engineering. Bradley was 28 years old. He had been at Summit Forge Systems for exactly 9 weeks. I had trained senior engineers who had trained other people, longer than Bradley had been active in the technology industry. Maxwell kept speaking, his voice smooth and untroubled. Bradley believes the current logistics architecture is unnecessarily complicated. His view is that the company has been carrying far too much legacy thinking, and we need to move toward a more streamlined approach, legacy thinking. That was what 24 years of midnight deployments, emergency customer system recoveries, complex database migrations, security reviews, and disaster recovery planning had become. I felt a tight constriction in my chest, but I kept my expression completely blank. Is that Bradley's assessment, I asked quietly, or is it yours? Maxwell offered a thin, dismissing smile. Does it really matter? That was their first major mistake. They assumed my silence meant I was defeated. Teresa finally spoke up, her voice rehearsed. Security will collect your company laptop and identification badge as soon as we finish here. You will be allowed to collect your personal items from your desk. I nodded slowly. Then I asked the only question that actually mattered. Has the legal department reviewed our continuing dependency on the OmniBridge framework? Maxwell actually chuckled, shaking his head. Gerald, Summit Forge Systems owns everything you have ever touched or written while working here. I stared at him for a second, letting the silence stretch. Are you absolutely certain about that? His smile vanished, replaced by a flash of annoyance. Yes, completely. There were 6 separate documents inside the termination packet. I read through every single page carefully. The first document acknowledged that I had received the official notice of termination. I signed that one. The second contained the severance terms. The third document was a much broader intellectual property release. It stated that I recognized Summit Forge Systems as the sole owner of all technical frameworks, libraries, tools, and supporting software assets associated with its logistics products. I placed my pen down on the table. I am not signing this document. Teresa looked up quickly, her eyes widening. Maxwell's jaw tightened and he leaned forward. Why not? Because it is not legally accurate. He gave a short, irritated laugh. Have your attorney waste time reviewing it if you want. I plan to do exactly that, I replied. That was the first moment he looked annoyed, but he was not worried. Not yet. 20 minutes later, I walked through the busy engineering floor, carrying a single cardboard box containing my personal belongings. The software engineers who had called me at midnight for help over the years suddenly became very interested in their computer monitors, avoiding my gaze. One junior developer near the elevators opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something, but he stopped when he saw Teresa standing right behind me. Another senior developer gave me the smallest, almost imperceptible nod. I did not blame them. Fear has a way of making good people quiet when they see a veteran cast out. At home, I placed the termination packet on my kitchen table. My son Owen was out at his university library, so the house was completely silent. I made a cup of tea that I never drank and opened an old, faded blue folder I had not needed in years. Inside was the original licensing agreement for the OmniBridge framework. I read the renewal clause twice to be absolutely certain. Then I checked the calendar date. The commercial license expired at midnight. I went to bed early without calling anyone. At exactly 3:45 in the morning, my phone began vibrating frantically on my nightstand. 22 missed calls. Summit Forge Systems had finally read the part Maxwell said did not matter. Summit Forge Systems had not always been a cold, corporate machine. When I first joined 24 years earlier, it was a tiny crew of 12 passionate people working out of a drafty, converted warehouse. We had cheap folding tables, noisy cooling fans, and a server room that sounded like a jet engine warming up on a runway. I was 34 years old back then, and my life was in pieces. My marriage had just ended in a painful divorce, and my son Owen was only 3 years old. Getting a stable income mattered far more to me than corporate prestige or high-flying titles. During the freezing winter months, the warehouse heating would fail entirely, and the founder would share his sandwiches with me while we huddled around a single space heater. I would bring Owen to the office and wrap him in a heavy wool blanket on a cot next to my desk while I coded late into the night. Summit Forge Systems desperately needed a senior systems architect, but simply could not afford to hire one on a full-time permanent basis. So I agreed to join them as an independent consultant. What almost nobody at the company remembered by the time Maxwell fired me was that I did not arrive at Summit Forge Systems empty-handed. Before joining them, I had spent 3 years building a highly specialized software framework through my own tiny company, Brooks Logic Studio. I called that framework OmniBridge. It was not flashy or exciting. Customers never saw it, and salespeople never mentioned it during product demonstrations. But it solved an incredibly ugly, expensive problem. It synchronized complex transaction data when old warehouse scanners, freight routing systems, inventory databases, customer APIs, and backup cloud servers all spoke completely different technical languages. The founder of Summit Forge Systems immediately understood what the framework could do for his business. He could not afford to purchase the code outright, so he signed a renewable commercial licensing agreement instead. Summit Forge Systems could build its application products on top of OmniBridge, but Brooks Logic Studio retained full ownership of the underlying framework. It was a simple, clean agreement, written down in clear legal terms, and for many years, nobody had a single issue with it. Eventually, Summit Forge Systems grew large enough to offer me a permanent, full-time position. I accepted the role because I believed in the future of the company and wanted to see our products succeed. The employment agreement I signed changed my status to a full-time employee, but the commercial OmniBridge license remained completely untouched. At the time, I thought we would clean up that licensing detail later on. That simple, lazy assumption would follow me for more than 2 decades. As the company expanded, my responsibilities grew heavier. I missed my son Owen's 10th birthday dinner because a critical system migration failed at a freight depot in Ohio, forcing me to spend the entire night debugging database scripts in a freezing warehouse. I spent hours on support calls in a hospital parking garage while my elderly mother was undergoing tests inside, sitting in my car with the heater running while listening to frantic operations managers. I spent one entire Christmas Eve rebuilding a broken system integration because a major retail client could not process overnight updates. Nobody forced me to make those sacrifices. I kept volunteering for the extra work because every crisis felt temporary and every sacrifice felt like validation that my contribution was essential. Whenever promotion cycles came around, however, the corporate answers remained exactly the same. You are far too critical where you are right now, Gerald. We cannot afford to move you out of the architecture group. Next year, once we stabilize the engineering team, we will look at moving you into executive leadership. I heard some version of that empty promise year after year. Meanwhile, I trained junior managers who quickly climbed the corporate ladder above me, and I explained complex systems to executives who earned massive annual performance bonuses. Then Maxwell Stone became the chief executive officer 9 years ago, and the company culture shifted dramatically. Maxwell preferred polished presentations and colorful slides over difficult technical questions. He demanded simple, convenient answers, even when the underlying systems were incredibly complex. Under his leadership, my daily work became less visible, while my operational responsibilities grew significantly heavier. My salary fell far behind the market rate, and new executives arrived with fancy titles I had been told were unavailable. I kept foolishly believing that my performance would eventually correct the corporate imbalance. Owen saw the reality long before I did. A few months before my firing, he was sitting at the kitchen counter filling out graduate school applications while I answered urgent work emails on my laptop. He looked up, watching me work, and asked, "Dad, why do you work so hard for people who never seem to appreciate you?" I offered a weak smile, pretending his question was naive. "Because loyalty to your team matters, Owen." He looked back down at his paperwork. "Does that loyalty travel in both directions, Dad?" I did not have an answer for him. The question lingered in my mind. A week later, I designed an architecture upgrade that saved a failing enterprise account. I had spent 4 months working on it. At the next investor update, Maxwell presented my strategy as his own executive initiative. My name was never mentioned. I told myself that getting results was more important than getting credit. That was how I survived the disappointment. I kept making excuses for them. The first voicemail on my phone was from Bradley, and his voice sounded absolutely nothing like it had during my termination meeting. "Gerald, something is completely wrong with our package repository. We are missing critical core code files, and our automated systems are failing to compile. Call me back immediately." The second voicemail was from Maxwell, followed by a tense message from Teresa, then 2 other senior software engineers, and finally Bradley once more. By 4 in the morning, I had 22 missed calls and 7 urgent emails waiting in my personal inbox. I sat at my kitchen table with the faded blue folder open beside me, listening to every voicemail in order before I made any attempt to contact anyone. What Forge Systems had just discovered was incredibly simple. Nothing had been deleted or corrupted, and I had not touched a single company server. OmniBridge was the foundational framework. Beneath Summit Forge Systems' entire logistics platform, which they valued at $8,400,000. Customers never saw the framework, but their warehouse scanners, cargo updates, inventory records, and external APIs all depended on it to communicate with the rest of the application. Summit Forge Systems owned the customer-facing software, but they did not own the underlying OmniBridge code. Years earlier, the company-owned lawyers had written that distinction into the licensing agreement. Summit Forge Systems was authorized to use the framework under an annual commercial license issued by Brooks Logic Studio, my personal LLC. The contract explicitly detailed what would happen if that license ever expired. Existing customer installations would continue to run for a short transition period, but the company would immediately lose access to the private repository, source updates, and the secure authentication keys required to compile new builds. The timing of my firing was almost comical. The annual renewal date for the OmniBridge license happened to fall on the exact same weekend Maxwell terminated my employment. Normally, the corporate accounting department processed the annual invoice associated with Brooks Logic Studio well before the expiration deadline. But when the Human Resources Department processed my termination, they immediately deactivated my internal employee status and canceled all pending vendor profiles connected to my name. Someone in corporate accounting had treated my LLC like a standard employee expense, so the automated renewal transaction was completely blocked. At 3:45 in the morning, the company automated build server kicked off a scheduled weekend release. This routine release included several minor security patches and was supposed to be completely automated. The build server requested authentication from the OmniBridge private repository, trying to pull the core libraries. The security validation handshake failed. The server waited 3 minutes and tried again, and it failed once more. The system security settings interpreted the failed authorization as an unauthorized breach attempt, automatically locking down the build pipeline and throwing dependency unresolved errors across multiple logistics services. To a junior engineer who did not understand the underlying architecture, it probably looked as though massive sections of their code base had vanished into thin air. But the code was not gone. Summit Forge Systems had simply lost the legal permission to retrieve the software packages they had never purchased. 8 years prior, outside legal counsel had warned the executive team that they must either purchase OmniBridge outright or maintain the commercial licensing agreement. Leadership chose the cheaper licensing path because I was always there to maintain the framework. They treated my presence as a permanent free resource. I had warned them multiple times. When we updated our disaster recovery procedures, I included a complete licensing review. When we migrated our package managers, I asked legal to confirm the framework status. My emails were politely received and promptly ignored. At 4:15 in the morning, Bradley's phone call came through again. I could hear the background noise of the engineering room in the background, a chaotic murmur of panicked voices and keyboards. This time, I decided to answer the phone. He did not even bother to say hello. "Where is the missing source code, Gerald? Why has our system access been revoked?" I looked down at the contract on my table. "There is no missing source code, Bradley. The code is exactly where it has always been." "Then why are our build servers throwing authentication errors? Why is the entire system failing to compile?" "Because your commercial license has officially expired," I explained calmly. In the background, I could hear Maxwell's voice shouting, demanding to know what I was saying, and telling Bradley to tell me to fix it immediately. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. I could hear Bradley's shallow breathing. "That is impossible," he finally stammered. "Our legal department said we own the platform." "You own the product code your team wrote," I replied, "but you do not own the licensed architecture underneath. You need to log in and restore our access immediately. We have a major release scheduled." I let several seconds pass before asking one simple question. "Has Maxwell read Schedule 4 of the licensing agreement yet?" The total silence on the line told me everything. For the first time since he had arrived, Bradley realized the system he called legacy complexity had strict legal rules he had never bothered to study, and those rules had just become the most expensive problem the company had ever faced. After Bradley hung up the phone, I sat quietly for a few minutes before calling my intellectual property attorney, Sarah Jenkins. I had known Sarah for 15 years, since the days when Summit Forge Systems was small enough that corporate legal decisions were finalized over paper cups of diner coffee. She answered on the second ring, her voice immediately alert. When I explained that I had been terminated and that the OmniBridge framework license had expired, she instructed me to remain completely passive. "Do not log into any company system, Gerald. Do not touch their servers. Do not look at their repositories. Do not download any code, and do not attempt to write a single line of scripts for them." I confirmed that I had no intention of doing so. "You are in an incredibly strong legal position," she assured me. Sarah explained the legal landscape clearly. The underlying code of the OmniBridge framework was registered with the United States Copyright Office under my personal LLC, Brooks Logic Studio. I had established this intellectual property before ever signing a full-time employment contract with the company. Under Title 17, Section 201 of the United States Code, my ownership of that work was fully protected, and the corporate license agreement confirmed that distinction. In addition, under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, specifically Section 1201, any unauthorized attempt to bypass our digital locks or retrieve package binaries without a valid license would carry serious civil and criminal penalties. More importantly, now that my employment had been terminated, I had absolutely no legal duty to provide emergency technical support or consulting services to Summit Forge Systems without a signed contract. "You do not need to punish them, Gerald," she noted. "You simply need to stop volunteering your time." That phrase echoed in my head because volunteering had been the quiet trap of my entire career. I had volunteered my personal time, weekends, and holidays to rescue the company from its own poor planning. At 8 in the morning, an email arrived from the operations director at Summit Forge Systems. Maxwell was copied on the message. The email requested that I temporarily restore repository access so they could compile their pending release, suggesting we could handle the paperwork later in the week. I immediately forwarded the email to Sarah. She responded on my behalf, stating that any temporary extension of the license would require a formal short-term contract, a prepaid licensing fee, and a separate emergency consulting agreement. 20 minutes later, Maxwell sent me a text message rejecting the proposal, calling my terms completely unreasonable. I did not reply. After years of receiving my emergency services for free, the concept of paying an invoice apparently felt like an insult to him. Around noon, my phone rang again, displaying a name that surprised me. It was Diana Mercer, the Chief Technology Officer at AeroRoute Systems, our primary competitor. Diana had contacted me 3 times in the previous 4 years about joining her executive team, but I had turned her down each time out of a misplaced sense of loyalty to Summit Forge Systems. "I heard you are finally available," Diana said. "News travels quickly in this business." We met at a regional technology conference several years ago where she had spent hours asking detailed questions about data architecture. She did not ask me to share proprietary information or client databases. Instead, she asked what kind of architecture group I wanted to build and what technical strategies I would implement if I had actual authority. She then brought up my framework. "We have considered building a data synchronization tool internally," she explained. "But we would much rather license a proven system, like OmniBridge, from the person who actually designed it." While Summit Forge Systems had spent years treating OmniBridge like a technical inconvenience they had to tolerate, Diana treated it as a valuable corporate asset. She offered me the position of Chief Architecture Officer, complete with executive authority, corporate equity, a seat in all future planning meetings, and a salary package significantly higher than what I had been earning at my old job. I told her I would consider the offer once I completed my separation from Summit Forge Systems. After we hung up, my phone buzzed with another text from Maxwell. He claimed I was deliberately withholding company property during an active commercial emergency, warning me that I was creating severe legal issues for myself. Under the advice of my attorney, I took a screenshot of the threat, forwarded it to Sarah, and turned off my phone. For the rest of that afternoon, the quiet in my house was almost overwhelming. My son Owen and I spent the day packing cardboard boxes with his old textbooks and college notes. Every book we handled felt like a reminder of how quickly the time had passed and how many milestones I had experienced only through a phone screen while sitting in server rooms. Looking at Owen, I realized that the silence of my phone was not a problem to be solved. It was a boundary I should have drawn 20 years ago. I did not feel anxious about the empty inbox. I felt a strange, quiet sense of relief, and for the first time in my life, I made dinner for my family without checking a single server status. By Monday morning, the situation at Summit Forge Systems had escalated from an internal technical inconvenience to a full-blown commercial disaster. Global Freight Alliance was one of the company's largest and most profitable enterprise clients. They had been promised a critical security-certified update by Monday afternoon as part of a contract expansion worth several $1 million. Bradley team simply could not compile the build without OmniBridge. Bradley tried to bypass the framework dependencies, telling Maxwell that the resolution would take 6 hours, then 12. By Sunday night, he had stopped giving estimates entirely. The software engineers quickly realized that OmniBridge was connected to far more than synchronization. Transaction recovery, data reconciliation, and database rollback logic all depended on it. Replace one library, and another part of the system immediately collapsed. One senior developer finally stated that I was the only person who understood why the codebase exceptions existed. That warning reached the board of directors. So did Global Freight Alliance response. At 10 in the morning, their technology chief, Donald Harris, informed Summit Forge Systems that all expansion payments were frozen until the company proved it could certify its own platform. Donald had worked directly with me for 11 years. He called me later that afternoon. I answered carefully, explaining that I could not discuss proprietary information. "I am not asking for details, Gerald," he said calmly. "I am calling because every major technical issue we have faced in 11 years was solved by you. Wherever you go next, will you still be building logistics systems?" I looked at the AeroRoute Systems offer open on my screen. Yes, I replied. Most likely. Donald was quiet for a second before responding. Good. That was all he said. There was no secret deal, just years of built-up trust. 3 days after Maxwell fired me, the board of directors requested an emergency meeting. I walked back into the conference room carrying only a notebook. Board chair Eleanor Sloan sat at the head of the table. Maxwell sat halfway down, looking exhausted, and Bradley sat silently beside him. Eleanor began by offering to reinstate me immediately with a 30% salary increase and a promotion to vice president of engineering. I did not touch the paperwork. No, I said, I am not returning. Maxwell's face tightened, and Eleanor asked what I wanted. I want our existing licensing agreement honored, I replied. Summit Forge Systems can purchase a limited perpetual license to the current version of OmniBridge at a professionally assessed price, or you can sign an 18-month transition license while your team rebuilds the framework. If you require my consulting assistance, it will be billed at my private consulting rate and limited to a maximum of 8 hours per week. Maxwell leaned forward, accusing me of capitalizing on a crisis I had created, but Eleanor raised her hand to silence him. Our general counsel confirmed that I had accessed no system since my termination and that I had warned the company about the license multiple times. Eleanor then turned to Bradley, asking if he had reviewed the dependency map or the licensing agreement before recommending my termination. Bradley stared at the table and admitted he had not. Eleanor looked at Maxwell and stated that he was no longer leading the negotiation. The board signed the 18-month transition agreement that afternoon, paying Brooks Logic Studio a substantial licensing fee. My consulting hours were strictly limited, and no midnight calls were allowed. During the transition weeks, I helped the engineering team patiently, answering their questions and explaining system dependencies, but I left the building exactly when my 8 hours were complete. 2 senior developers from Summit Forge Systems later resigned and applied to AeroRoute Systems. I hired one and recommended the other to another team. I had no interest in dismantling my old company, but they wanted to work in an environment where expertise was respected. 6 months later, I had fully transitioned into my role as Chief Architecture Officer at AeroRoute Systems. The company culture was entirely different. Diana Mercer never asked me to prove my value through exhaustion. If I identified a technical risk, she allocated the necessary resources. If we designed a system, my name remained on it. Brooks Logic Studio continued to operate as an independent entity, licensing OmniBridge to other non-competing businesses. Summit Forge Systems survived, but Maxwell Stone stepped down as Chief Executive Officer after a board investigation into investor disclosures. Bradley Finch resigned shortly afterward. That fall, Owen moved out to begin his graduate studies. As I helped him unpack his things in his new apartment, he remarked that I looked far less tired. I smiled, thinking back to his question about loyalty. I still believe loyalty matters, but I now understand that it must travel in both directions. Deserved respect is not earned by sacrificing your personal life to prove you are essential. Sometimes, being essential only teaches the wrong people how much they can take from you before you finally walk away. One evening at AeroRoute Systems, I finished reviewing a complex system proposal and looked up at the clock. It was 5:42 in the evening. Most of the engineering team was already packing up, and there was no sense of impending doom or panic. Under my new leadership, we built reliable systems that did not rely on a single exhausted developer. I closed my laptop and headed home to have dinner with my family. The software systems would still compile tomorrow, and the company would still stand. I had finally learned that my professional skills were valuable, but my personal life was irreplaceable.